Most people believe that losing muscle after 60 is simply what aging does, an inevitable, unstoppable biological surrender that no amount of effort or intention can meaningfully reverse. That belief is not only wrong, it is one of the most consequential scientific misconceptions in the entire field of human health, because the muscle you build or preserve after 60 is not merely about physical appearance or athletic performance. It is about how long you live, how independently you live, and how fully your body continues to serve the life you still intend to lead. There is a particular kind of loss that is most devastating, precisely because it does not feel like loss while it is happening. It does not arrive with the sharp, unmistakable announcement of an injury or the undeniable declaration of a diagnosis. It arrives instead as a gradual, almost imperceptible thinning, a quiet subtraction from the physical self that proceeds so slowly, so consistently, and so completely beneath the threshold of daily awareness that most people do not recognize it for what it is until its consequences have already accumulated far beyond what any single moment of recognition would suggest. The progressive loss of skeletal muscle mass and function that scientists call sarcopenia is precisely this kind of invisible diminishment. And understanding it, truly understanding it at the biological level, rather than merely acknowledging it as an abstract inevitability of aging, may be the single most important piece of health knowledge any person over 60 can carry into the decisions they make about how they eat, how they move, and how seriously they take the physical capacity that remains available to them. Sarcopenia begins earlier than most people expect and progresses more consequentially than most people appreciate. Research consistently demonstrates that skeletal muscle mass begins declining measurably from approximately the fourth decade of life, not at 60, not at 70, but at 40, at a rate of roughly 3 to 5% per decade under typical conditions, a rate that accelerates significantly after 60 as the hormonal, inflammatory, and cellular changes of advancing age compound the losses that time alone has already initiated. By the time a person reaches their late 60s or early 70s without deliberate nutritional and physical intervention, the cumulative muscle loss may represent 20 to 30% or more of the peak muscle mass they carried in their 30s, a reduction so substantial in its metabolic and mechanical consequences that it touches virtually every aspect of physical function, systemic health, and biological resilience in ways that extend far beyond anything suggested by the simple observation that a person looks or feels less physically strong than they once did. To understand why this matters so profoundly, you must understand what skeletal muscle actually is in biological terms, not merely the tissue that moves limbs and lifts objects, but a metabolically active endocrine organ that participates in the regulation of glucose metabolism, insulin sensitivity, immune function, thermoregulation, and the amino acid economy upon which the immune system draws during every episode of illness, injury, or physiological stress the body encounters. Muscle tissue is the body's largest repository of stored amino acids, the molecular building blocks from which immune proteins, repair enzymes, and structural tissues throughout the body are synthesized when dietary supply is temporarily insufficient. A body with abundant, well-maintained muscle mass carries within it a biological reserve of extraordinary versatility and resilience. A body from which sarcopenia has quietly subtracted 30% of that reserve carries a proportionally diminished capacity to respond to the physiological challenges that become more frequent, more demanding, and more consequential with every decade of advancing. There is a moment in the history of nutritional science when a single, ordinary, universally familiar food was quietly revealed to be something far more biologically sophisticated than its modest appearance had ever suggested. And that moment belongs, with considerable justification, to the egg. For decades, the egg occupied an uncomfortable and scientifically contested position in the public health conversation. Celebrated for its protein, feared for its cholesterol, rehabilitated, recondemned, and rehabilitated again across a cycle of nutritional revision, that reflected less the egg's changing biology than the evolving and sometimes humbling limitations of the science attempting to evaluate it. What has emerged from that long and complicated conversation, particularly in the specific context of muscle biology in older adults, is a picture of nutritional completeness and biological relevance that makes the egg one of the most strategically important foods available to any person over 60 who is serious about preserving and building the physical strength that determines so much of what independent life actually requires. The protein in an egg is among the highest quality available in the entire human food supply, not merely in terms of its amino acid completeness, containing all 9 essential amino acids in proportions that closely match the requirements of human muscle tissue, but in terms of its digestibility and biological availability, the degree to which the protein consumed is actually absorbed, transported to muscle tissue, and made available for the synthetic processes that build and repair muscle fibers. But within that complete amino acid profile, one amino acid deserves particular attention, not because the others are unimportant, but because leucine occupies a position in the biology of muscle protein synthesis that is categorically different from every other amino acid the body uses. Leucine is not merely a building block. It is a signaling molecule, a molecular key that activates the mTOR pathway, the mechanistic target of rapamycin, which functions as the master regulatory switch, determining whether the cellular machinery of muscle protein synthesis is turned on or off at any given moment. Understanding the mTOR pathway in the context of aging is essential to understanding why leucine-rich foods like eggs are not merely helpful for seniors trying to maintain muscle, but are specifically and mechanistically necessary in a way they are not for younger adults. In a young, hormonally robust physiology, the mTOR pathway responds readily to protein intake. A moderate meal containing adequate total protein is generally sufficient to cross the leucine threshold required to activate synthesis and initiate the process of muscle repair and growth. But in the aging muscle, a phenomenon that researchers call anabolic resistance progressively raises that activation threshold. The same quantity of protein that reliably triggered robust muscle protein synthesis at 30 produces a significantly attenuated response at 65, not because the pathway has been destroyed, but because its sensitivity has diminished, requiring a higher leucine signal to achieve the same degree of activation that a lower signal once produced with ease. This is not a minor inefficiency. It is a fundamental shift in the biology of muscle building that has profound practical implications for how older adults should think about the protein sources they choose and the quantities in which they consume. There is a biological principle that sits at the heart of understanding why certain foods matter more for muscle building in older adults than their protein content alone would suggest, and it is a principle that the conventional conversation about senior nutrition has been slow to fully appreciate. Building muscle is not simply a matter of providing the raw materials for construction. It is a matter of creating the internal biological environment in which construction is actually permitted to proceed. Because in the aging body, that environment is frequently and significantly hostile to the very process it needs to support, saturated with the inflammatory signaling that actively dismantles muscle protein faster than a compromised anabolic system can replace it. And this is precisely where oily fish, salmon, mackerel, sardines, trout, herring enter the conversation not as a peripheral supporting player, but as one of the most biologically consequential foods available to any senior attempting to build or preserve physical strength in a body whose internal chemistry has shifted against that goal. The omega-3 fatty acids delivered by oily fish, specifically eicosapentaenoic acid and docosahexaenoic acid, have been studied in the context of muscle biology with increasing scientific sophistication across the past 2 decades, and what that research has revealed is a story of biological action operating simultaneously through 2 distinct and complementary mechanisms, each addressing a different dimension of the sarcopenic challenge, together producing a combined effect on muscle mass and function in older adults that neither mechanism alone could fully account for. Understanding both mechanisms, the direct and the indirect, the anabolic and the anti-inflammatory, is essential to appreciating why the regular consumption of oily fish is not merely a general health recommendation for seniors, but a specifically targeted nutritional intervention with measurable consequences for the biology of muscle that no other commonly available food category replicates with equivalent completeness. The direct mechanism operates at the level of the muscle cell membrane itself, and to understand it, you must first understand what a cell membrane actually does in the context of muscle protein synthesis. The membrane of a muscle cell is not merely a passive boundary separating the cell's interior from its external environment. It is a dynamic, functionally active structure that participates in the reception and transduction of the molecular signals, including the amino acid and hormonal signals that trigger muscle protein synthesis, that arrive at the cell's surface from the surrounding biological environment. The composition of that membrane, specifically the ratio of saturated to unsaturated fatty acids incorporated into its phospholipid bilayer, directly influences its fluidity, its receptor density, and its sensitivity to incoming signals. Omega-3 fatty acids, when present in adequate dietary quantities, integrate into muscle cell membranes and measurably increase their fluidity and receptor responsiveness, including the responsiveness of the mTOR signaling machinery to leucine and other anabolic amino acids. In practical terms, this means that a senior consuming adequate omega-3 fatty acids through regular oily fish consumption will achieve a greater muscle protein synthetic response to the same protein meal than they would in an omega-3 depleted cellular state, effectively reducing the anabolic resistance threshold that makes muscle building so much more challenging in the aging physiology than it was in the WAM. There is a question that sits quietly beneath almost every conversation about protein and muscle building in older adults. A question so practical, so immediately applicable to daily life, and yet so rarely asked with the scientific precision it deserves. And that question is not how much protein to eat, but when and in what distribution. Across the hours of the day, the protein consumed actually reaches the muscle tissue that needs it in a form and quantity sufficient to genuinely trigger the synthetic response that builds and preserves physical strength. Because the research emerging from the most rigorous investigations into senior muscle nutrition over the past decade has made something increasingly clear, that the timing and distribution of protein intake across individual meals is not a secondary consideration to be addressed after total quantity has been optimized, but a primary determinant of whether the protein a senior consumes each day actually accomplishes the muscle-building work it is theoretically capable of performing, or whether it is redirected toward energy metabolism and waste excretion in a body whose anabolic window has quietly narrowed with the passing decades. Greek yogurt enters this conversation as both a nutritional solution and an illuminating lens through which the broader principles of senior protein timing become practically visible. Because it combines, within a single widely available and genuinely palatable food, a protein composition specifically suited to the biological realities of the aging muscle, a leucine content capable of meaningfully contributing to the threshold activation of muscle protein synthesis at a single meal, and a practical versatility that makes it uniquely well-positioned to address the distributional challenge that so many older adults face when attempting to spread adequate protein across the full architecture of a day's eating. The protein in Greek yogurt is a mixture of two structurally distinct dairy proteins, whey and casein, whose different rates of digestion and absorption create a temporal pattern of amino acid delivery to the bloodstream that serves the aging muscle's synthetic needs in ways that neither protein alone could achieve with equivalent completeness. Whey protein is rapidly digested, producing a sharp, relatively brief elevation in circulating amino acid concentrations, including leucine, that arrives at muscle tissue quickly and triggers an acute anabolic response with a speed and intensity that makes it particularly valuable in the context of the post-exercise window when muscle protein synthetic machinery is most receptive to incoming signals. Casein digests slowly, releasing amino acids into the circulation across a period of several hours following consumption, maintaining circulating leucine concentrations above the threshold required for sustained synthetic activity long after the whey-driven acute response has subsided. The combination of these two proteins within a single food creates an extended anabolic environment that is particularly well matched to the biological reality of the aging muscle, a tissue that cannot sustain the same intensity of synthetic response as a younger muscle, but benefits considerably from the extended duration of adequate amino acid availability that the whey-casein combination reliably. The principle of leucine threshold achievement at each individual meal deserves to be understood with a clarity that conventional nutritional advice has consistently failed to provide to older adults, because it represents one of the most important and most practically actionable insights in the entire science of senior muscle nutrition, and its implications for how protein intake should be structured across the day are both specific and significant. Research in older adult populations has consistently demonstrated that muscle protein synthesis is not a continuous process that responds proportionally to total daily protein intake in the way that a simple supply and demand model would suggest. It is instead a pulsatile process, one that is activated by individual meals when those meals deliver sufficient leucine to cross the signaling threshold of the mTOR pathway, sustains its response for a limited post-meal window of approximately 2 to 3 hours, and then returns to baseline regardless of how much additional protein is consumed within that same meal or across the immediately following hours. A meal that delivers 5 grams of leucine does not produce a meaningfully greater synthetic response than one delivering 3. The pathway is activated, the window opens, and additional leucine beyond the threshold is simply metabolized rather than directed toward additional muscle building. But a meal that delivers only 1 gram of leucine, which is entirely possible when protein portions are small, protein sources are low in leucine density, or appetite has declined as it so commonly does in older adults, fails to activate the pathway at all, producing no meaningful muscle protein synthetic response regardless of the total protein consumed across the rest of the. This is why the distribution of leucine-sufficient protein intake across 3 or 4 meals throughout the day produces superior muscle-building outcomes in older adults compared to the same total daily protein consumed in 1 or 2 large meals. Not because total quantity is unimportant, but because the muscle can only utilize the anabolic signal generated by each individual leucine threshold crossing once per meal occasion, making the number of threshold crossings across the day a primary determinant of total daily muscle protein synthetic activity. Greek yogurt, with its leucine content, its dual protein temporal profile, and its practical convenience as both a meal component and a between-meal nutritional bridge, is one of the most effective tools available for ensuring that the leucine threshold is consistently achieved not merely at one meal, but at multiple eating occasions across the day, transforming the theoretical daily protein intake into the actual pattern of muscle synthetic activation that physical strength after 60 genuinely. There is a particular kind of wisdom that arrives not through the dramatic discovery of something entirely new, but through the deeper, more patient understanding of something that has always been present, something familiar enough to be overlooked, ordinary enough to be underestimated, and sufficiently humble in its appearance that its true biological significance requires a quality of scientific attention that the noise of nutritional fashion rarely allows. Legumes occupy exactly this position in the conversation about muscle building after 60. The lentil, the chickpea, the black bean, the edamame sitting quietly on the plate without the cultural cachet of premium protein sources, without the marketing investment of supplement industries, without the dramatic biological narrative that makes other foods easier to champion with enthusiasm. And yet within them lives a nutritional complexity whose full value to the aging muscular system only becomes visible when it is understood not in isolation, but in the context of the whole biological environment in which muscle building either succeeds or fails. The honest conversation about plant protein and muscle synthesis in older adults must begin with an acknowledgement that the science does not permit to be glossed over, that the leucine density of legume protein is genuinely lower than that of animal protein sources, and that anti-nutritional factors present in many legumes, including phytates and enzyme inhibitors, do reduce the digestibility and biological availability of their protein to a degree that matters when the margin between adequate and inadequate leucine threshold achievement is already narrow in an anabolically resistant older physiology. These are real limitations, and they deserve honest recognition rather than the ideological dismissal that nutritional tribalism sometimes substitutes for scientific accuracy. But honest recognition of a limitation is not the same as dismissal of the food that carries it. And the strategic response to lower leucine density is not to abandon legumes, but to consume them in quantities and combinations that compensate for that density, while simultaneously delivering the broader nutritional benefits that make legumes irreplaceable components of a senior muscle-building dietary pattern when understood in their full biological context. That broader context begins with the gut microbiome, the vast, still being mapped community of microorganisms inhabiting the human intestinal tract whose influence on systemic health, including the health of the muscular system, is one of the most rapidly expanding frontiers in contemporary biological science. The dietary fiber delivered by legumes, specifically the prebiotic fibers that selectively nourish beneficial bacterial populations, supports the diversity and abundance of a gut microbiome whose metabolic products, including short-chain fatty acids produced through bacterial fermentation, appear to influence muscle protein metabolism, insulin sensitivity, and the systemic inflammatory state in ways that researchers are only beginning to quantify, but that are already understood to be meaningful. A gut microbiome supported by adequate prebiotic fiber produces a systemic biological environment that is measurably more hospitable to muscle protein synthesis and preservation than one depleted by a fiber-poor dietary pattern. And legumes, consumed regularly and strategically, are among the most potent prebiotic food sources available to the senior body at any meal. The anti-inflammatory phytonutrients carried within legumes, the flavonoids, the polyphenols, the plant compounds that modulate the inflammatory signaling cascades underlying so much of the sarcopenic process, contribute to the same biological goal that omega-3 fatty acids pursue through their own mechanisms: the reduction of the chronic systemic inflammation that in the aging body actively promotes muscle protein breakdown, impairs satellite cell activity, and creates the hostile internal environment in which every dietary and exercise effort toward muscle building works against a biological current running in the opposite direction. Legumes do not address this inflammatory environment with the potency of oily fish or the directness of targeted anti-inflammatory intervention, but they address it consistently, meal after meal, through the accumulated anti-inflammatory contribution of a dietary pattern that includes them regularly. And consistency, in the biology of the aging body, is a more powerful force than any single dramatic intervention applied occasionally. What legumes ultimately represent in this conversation, and what the entire nutritional story of these 5 foods has been building toward, is the understanding that muscle building after 60 is not a simple equation of protein in, muscle out, but a complex biological undertaking that requires simultaneous attention to the anabolic signals that activate synthesis, the inflammatory environment that determines whether synthesis can proceed, the gut biological context that influences nutrient availability and systemic metabolic tone, and the distribution and timing principles that determine whether the protein consumed each day is actually reaching its intended biological destination. No single food addresses all of these dimensions, but the 5 foods discussed across this entire conversation, eggs, oily fish, Greek yogurt, and the legumes that close it, together address them with a comprehensiveness and a scientific coherence that makes their combination not merely a nutritional recommendation, but a biologically intelligent strategy for the specific and serious challenge of maintaining physical strength in a body whose internal chemistry has shifted against that goal in ways that only knowledge and the daily choices that knowledge makes possible can meaningfully counteract. Building muscle after 60 is an act of biological self-determination. It is the decision, made daily and quietly at every meal, to give the body what the science says it actually needs, rather than what habit and assumption have always provided. It is the refusal to accept the slow surrender of physical capacity as inevitable when the evidence so clearly demonstrates that it is negotiable, responsive to care, to knowledge, to the consistent application of nutritional intelligence that is now available to every person willing to seek it out. And the strength built through that daily determination is not merely physical. It is the foundation of independence, of resilience, of the capacity to inhabit the years ahead with a fullness and a freedom that no amount of passive acceptance of decline could ever preserve. If this conversation has given you something genuinely valuable, a scientific clarity about your own body, a renewed belief in what is still possible, a practical understanding of why these 5 foods matter in ways you had never fully appreciated before, then bring that value to the community that creates it every single week and keeps the conversation growing. Come and find Dr. Martin Hale on YouTube, your dedicated home for senior health built on exactly the same foundation as every word of this speech: rigorous science, honest delivery, and an absolute unwavering commitment to the belief that the human body after 60 retains a capacity for strength, renewal, and vitality that the culture of aging has consistently and tragically underestimated. If this moved you, if it gave you something worth keeping, press the like button, because that single action tells the algorithm that this conversation deserves to reach another senior who is losing muscle right now without understanding why or what they could do about it. And your like may be the reason they finally find the answer. Share this with someone you love who is navigating these years alongside you. A partner, a parent, a friend who deserves to know that the strength they are losing is not gone, but waiting to be reclaimed through the simple, daily, biologically intelligent act of eating with genuine understanding. And subscribe to Dr. Martin Hale's Senior Health so that every video created for your physical strength, your biological resilience, and your capacity to live the years ahead with the full power of a body that has been properly